published more than 400 papers, and she's edited several books.
And this is me and my mom. And I put this up because my mother died of alcoholism. My mother became an alcoholic, really didn't so when the first monkeys went into space, Ham and Abel. My father was the guy that trained them to manipulate the lever. Guys go to Hopkins at any point. This is, they dedicated a building to my father probably, maybe 2 or 3 years ago. Everybody, I did have my first scientific publication at age 10 in 1962 in the Journal of the Experimental Analysis of Behavior, and this is it. I did a little science project and I wrote it up, and so I've got 3 lovely daughters who are all able to earn their own living, and I'm very proud of them and happy. Why would you say, South Carolina is such a conservative state, so many embarrassing things, emanate from South Carolina. I would say my first 10 or 15 clinical publications were just about, hey guys, look, there's a lot of substance use among psychiatrists, but if you had asked me at that time, am I consciously aware that I'm trying to solve some childhood dilemma through my research, I would have said, you guys like to solve problems. I like to tackle a good problem and solve it. I like to make things easier for myself and for other people. And to me, that's the most, that was a lot of the fun of doing administrative work, was trying to make the environment better for everybody's research. There is a lot of social cultural aspects to what we call an addiction, how we treat an addiction, how we define it. So this is an area I think where it's particularly important to talk to other people. I mean, none of us really have the holy grail in this, so it's kind of important to hear the various perspectives on this very complex and thorny disease that we're all trying. I'm a big one on life balance. I'm a big one on saying that it make time for family, health, and hobbies, that it's really, really important to keep yourself healthy.
And a woman in this position, you've given yourself as a model to others, and I see all the women you have mentored at MUSC. I think MUSC is very proud of the number of female scientists who are.
Good morning, good evening, good night. It's really nice to see so many people on the talk this morning from where I am. It's a real pleasure for me actually to be introducing Professor Dr. Kathleen Brady, who's the Vice President for Research and the Distinguished Professor at the Medical University of South Carolina. Dr. Brady did her MD, a PhD from the Medical College of Virginia, and an MD from Medical University of South Carolina, and also her residency in psychiatry at that same institution. And she's been there since 1985 and hasn't left. That's pretty amazing. She became an assistant professor at the university, and then is now a distinguished university professor. Those distinguished university professors, as you may or may not know, are really rare to come by. When I was at Columbia University in New York, people used to fight to see if they'd get one of those, and they were just Nobel Prize winners who had them. So Dr. Brady is at the level of Nobel Prize winners at Columbia University. So she's gotten every award that you can think of. There's just too numerous for me to mention them. She's been on the membership committees for the American College of Neuropsychopharmacology. She's got an award for research in women's health from the NIH. She's received grants from NIDA, the National Institute on Drug Abuse, or National Institute on Alcohol Abuse and Alcoholism, and consistently throughout her career. So I think her path to the love of the neuroscience of addiction has been really amazing. So I don't want to delay this any further, except to say that she's published more than 400 papers, and she's edited several books. And I think this morning, evening, or night, you're going to have a real treat listening to that, Professor Brady. Thank you.
Thank you so much, John Luke. That was that was a very nice introduction. And thank you, Hamed, and the rest of the group who've been organizing this. I'm very honored to be asked to do this. Can everybody hear me okay? I just want to make sure my microphone's working. Yeah, that's good. Because I have, as you can tell, I'm very technically challenged. But if I could have the next slide. I say a long and winding road, career musings, but as John Luke said, I've been in the same place for many, many years. And I do have some advice. This is mostly going to be about advice and personal stuff, and not so much science. I'm happy to talk about science with anybody, any of the areas that our group works in, but it just seemed like, this is an hour and a half long, a lot of time, and it might not be all that interesting to make it full of data. So I chose a different path, but let me just say, I do want to keep this informal. I'd love for people to interrupt me, ask questions about anything. And let me begin by saying one of the reasons one thing that can be a disadvantage of staying in one place for a long time is that perhaps you don't network as well as you might if you jump from institution to institution and make new colleagues and new collaborations. For that reason, for me and other people that stay in one place for a long time, really important, these national and international meetings and opportunities to come to a collaboration over a meeting and each go your separate way, but continue to talk and work together. Also, the other thing that happens if you stay in one institution for a long time, you begin to be like a piece of furniture. People overlook you all the time. They don't really think, oh yeah, well, we know. So I think you have to be very intentional about, every 10 years or so, sort of looking at your career, looking at what you're doing, and say, what are opportunities? What are ways that I could shake this up a little bit and maybe, have some more fun without leaving? Because I think not only people overlook you, but it's easy to get stale in a job and think about doing things the same way. So I'm an advocate of a little introspection and intentionality about one's career, although I do think also it's really important to take advantage of opportunities, unanticipated opportunities that come your way. So anyway, I'm going to tell you a little bit about my family history, because I think, like anyone, my family history has shaped really where I've gone in my career, and then a little bit about my own personal history. Then I will talk about career, research career, mentoring, which has been an important part of my career, and then administration, which I've been in more recently, and then a few take-home messages. So if I could have the next slide. Thank you. So these were my grandparents on my mother's side. They are, my grandparents on my mother's side were Irish immigrants. So they came to the United States, I don't know, in the 1919, 1920, had 10 children, lived in Brooklyn. They had a pretty difficult life, but they had 10 kids that all ended up doing pretty. One died in World War II, but otherwise fairly successful. But my grandfather was a pretty terrible alcoholic. I never met him, and he was apparently fairly abusive. He died probably when he was 45, 50 years old. But, they had their kids young, so the kids were all grown up and had all been part of that household. If I could have the next slide. This is my mom, and she had 6 sisters. So there were 7 girls and 3 boys in this family, and they were all just really lovely, fun. It was sort of amazing to meet these people, knowing that they had been brought up in what was a very difficult and pretty impoverished home. So if I could have the next slide. My father and his family also came from Brooklyn, but they were like in Bay Ridge, sort of a more uppity part of Brooklyn. And actually, my great-grandfather, the guy on the left here, was the CEO of Phillips Milk of Magnesia. So they were German immigrants, but came over in like the 1850s. And there was actually, the rumor always sort of spread around my family that, great-grandpa had committed suicide on the day, Black Friday, when the stock market crashed. And in fact, our family did lose control of that business. And when my dad died, we were looking through archives of stuff and came up with a New York Times article. It was right there that this man had jumped off the Staten Island ferry and killed himself on Black Friday. So my father's side really, and actually, I'm going to tell you that on my mother, from my mother's side and through that generation, alcohol dependence off and on has been a theme. On the other side, we've had there's been a lot of depression in, cousins and that sort of thing from my father's side of the family. But my grandfather, the gentleman right next to my great-grandfather, was actually one of the most cheerful, lovely, played piano and sang all the time, and he was a salesman. And so whatever it was, that darkness skipped him. So if I can go to the next slide. So from these 2 very different backgrounds, my mother, Cecilia, well, not different, but, they were both in Brooklyn, New York. I mean, couldn't be that different. My mother, Cecilia O'Malley, meets Joseph Vincent Brady. And he was inducted early, graduated from college early to go into World War II. They were doing a lot of that back there in the 40s. And next slide, they bring together their very large families. There's lots of beach and boat time in my family history. And next slide, the 2 of them get married. And they ended up going over to Germany to post-World War II the Americans were sort of, stayed in Germany. And that's where actually during World War II, he started doing some ECT. That was what they were treating post-traumatic stress disorder with at that time. He was just an undergraduate. He only had an undergraduate degree in psychology, but, anybody, World War II, they were pretty desperate for ways to treat guys on the front line. So they would do ECT and send people back. But that got my father very interested in sort of psychology and behavioral treatments and that sort of stuff. So when he finished in the Army, he actually stayed in the Army till for another 25 years, but he got his PhD from the University of Chicago in psychology. Next slide. But at the same time that they were doing that, they were having kids. So this is my older sister, Barb. I'm in the middle there. And then my brother, Mike. Next slide. There are 4 of us. And then in the next slide, there are 5 of us. So this is my immediate sibling group we all have remained very close. My mother died. I'll tell you a little bit about that. And then my dad has remarried. So now there's it's a bigger group. There's 9 of us all together when we all get together. So if I could have the next slide. So that's me and my dad. I've always had a healthy appetite. That's something that has still not gone away. Next slide. And this is me and my mom. And I put this up because my mother died of alcoholism. My mother became an alcoholic, really didn't drink heavily during early, she had one of these sort of atypical histories during her early marriage or anything. I mean, none of my siblings have fetal alcohol or any signs of that, but it was sort of later on, maybe in mid-30s or so, but had a very rapid trajectory. She had liver cirrhosis probably within 8 years of beginning, and died of that. And when she was pretty close mouth about her family history until those times when she was drinking a lot, and she would tell us all about really terrible stories of abuse by her father. This definitely has shaped my career, but not in ways that didn't show up for at least another 10 or 15 years. So if I could have the next slide. The other issue, person that really shaped my career. So through all of this, my dad, 5 and then 9 kids, that he was actually a pretty good dad, didn't know how to, it was just hard. We always had lots of help in the house, and, we had live-in nannies and all that kind of stuff. It was just difficult to have a very active career, which he did. He's a very dedicated career scientist. So his first experiment that sort of got him fame, if we can go back one, my dad did this executive monkey experiment. That's two, I have to go back one more. And in this experiment, if we can go back one more, okay, this is a really cool experiment. He was in the Army at the time he did this. Two monkeys. One is allowed to control the shock. The other monkey is yoked to that control monkey. And so the other monkey is getting shocked without being able to control it. So executive monkey A, can learn which lever to press and when these lights are on and that light, and he can avoid the shock. But monkey B, the worker bee monkey, is getting shocked, and he doesn't know why, and there's nothing he can do about it, right? So their hypothesis was the executive monkey is going to develop physiologic signs and symptoms of stress. Stress-related ulcers is what they were looking at. These days, we'd probably be looking for brain changes. But anyway, when they sacrificed the monkeys at the end of this experiment, what they found consistently was that the executive monkeys were fine. It was the monkeys getting the uncontrollable shock, the ones that didn't have any responsibility for it, but also couldn't control it, that had, rampant peptic ulcer disease. That was the endpoint that they were looking at as a biomarker of stress. So this was a really, it was one of the big lessons of science. You've heard it from many other people is, when your hypothesis is wrong, that's not a failed experiment. A failed experiment is one that fails to tell you anything or is methodologically flawed. If you do a good experiment and your hypothesis was wrong, that's, you got to look at the results and learn from those, because so this executive ulcer monkey executive experiment is really in every basic, certainly in the United States. I've never taken a psychology course outside of the US, but in every basic psychology 101, they talk about this experiment as one of the first ones that really connected stress to a physiologic change in organisms. So next slide, that's going backwards. Since my dad was in the Army at that time, and that was a really, it was a groundbreaking experiment. I think it was 1964 or something. They asked him, and it was with monkeys, and it was clear he had some facility in training monkeys, could get them to do all kinds of things. So when the first monkeys went into space, Ham and Abel, my father was the guy that trained them to manipulate the levers that would, let the thing take off. And then when they came back down, this was the even harder thing. When they come down from space, they splash into the oceans. God only knows where, and they need to manipulate some things to get themselves out, because those things are airtight, and your rescue crew can't get you out. The monkeys needed to know how to and when to manipulate these things. So he he was the one that trained those monkeys. He was down and back and forth from Cape Canaveral all the time. And if I could have the next slide, he So that's his hand on the cover of Life magazine. Those are the two monkeys, Ham and Abel. And if I could have the next slide, this is just sort of and he remained very involved in the space program until he died. In fact, at age 75 or something, he wrote a grant to NASA to send an experiment up in space. And it was again, a behavioral, because he worked with NASA the whole time, he was constantly interested in doing behavioral experiments on these guys through space, especially if you're up there for a year or two and orbiting, and just sort of how do you keep people getting along? One of the biggest problems in the Russian space program, apparently, with these 2 and 3 year flights, was these guys would stop cooperating. They would fight with each other. So they actually, one of the things that they did a controlled environment where the astronauts actually had to work to interact with each other. So they were not allowed to interact with each other until they had finished their day's work. So making interaction a prize in that sort of situation is actually very helpful in keeping people getting along over the long run. You can imagine being in a closed space with 3 highly competitive, ego-driven people for 2 to 3 years could get on your nerves, So he stayed involved with them, and at age 70, got a grant from them to send something else up in space with a new experiment. So next slide. So needless to say, my dad was an inspiration to me. The other thing he did, for better or worse, he was the Belmont Report is the the Belmont group was the bioethics group that got together to come up with the initial principles to guide human research. And again, this was in the 60s, and he was the only psychologist that was on that. So when you read any of your trainings about the IRB and what are the principles that guide our beneficence and justice, the principles that guide our research with human subjects, and that he was part of the committee that came up with those initial principles. So next slide. So needless to say, but also very close calling series with Jerry Jaffe and Roger Meyer. Always had big boats. He was a larger than life kind of guy. Next slide. He was always out on boats, and this is our lab group. He came down to Richmond when I was there and took my whole lab group boating one time. So, it was kind of the end. If I could have the next slide, he was also very committed to family. This is age, I don't know what, my dad was probably 78 at that point, but and this is only about half of us, but we have an annual family reunion. It's now up to about 40 or 50 people. We need to get a couple of houses, but that was something that he organized very regularly. So next slide. And then my final, they did, if any of you guys go to Hopkins at any point, they dedicated a building to my father probably, maybe 2 or 3 years ago. So we were all there for the dedication, along with about 500 cousins because you can imagine, I got 10, I've got 8 aunts and uncles on one side. I've got 4 on the other. Both of those sets had tons of kids. And so we thought, well, let's invite everybody to the building dedication. So this entire lobby was filled with people giving the Bronx cheer when I said, we were talking about the Joseph B. Brady building. Everybody was like, woo, hooting and hollering. I think it was actually something that was a little unusual for a Hopkins building dedication, but it was fun for us. Next slide. And that's again, the family with cousins and everything when we were down at the pier at Hopkins. Next slide. So away from back to my upbringing and how things influenced me. Obviously, I'm Catholic, not really actively practicing, but I went to, this is, I think, First Holy Communion, if I'm not mistaken, just judging by the dress, by the garb. But I went to Catholic schools really up until college. Next slide. And in some ways, you could say that was my version of early life trauma, in addition to sort of having a little bit of a chaotic life. But anyway, I found a lot of things about Catholicism a little bit difficult to deal with, but it does give a lot of structure and rigor. Next slide. And so as I said, I went through, actually in up through high school, I was up through grammar school, I'd say I was a pretty good student. Then I became a terrible student in high school, but I just wanted to point this out to everybody. I did have my first scientific publication at age 10 in 1962 in the Journal of the Experimental Analysis of Behavior. And this is it. I did a little science project and I wrote it up. And this guy, actually, John Boren, was a friend of my dad's, but he thought that the writing was very clear and thought it was a great example of kids in science, so, and especially girls in science. So they published that. I'm very proud of that. Although when you look on my CV, there's like a 30-year gap from my first publication to my second. And often people will look at that and say, well, what happened? Why weren't you publishing after that? So next slide. So I, was actually a mediocre student really in high school, got back into it again in college. But then when I got out of college, I wasn't sure that I really wanted to do anything serious, at least not for a while. So I went and skied for like 2 or 3 years. I spent about 2.5 years out in Breckenridge, Colorado, and skied every day and just hung out. And I think my parents were sort of despairing that, or my dad anyway, that anything was going to come of me. Next slide. But I did end up deciding that I was probably better off doing something. I really saw that was a bit of a dead end, being a waitress and skiing every day, even though it was a lot of fun. So I decided to go back to get my MD, PhD. I went to Virginia Commonwealth University. I had the best mentor. So I'd have to say this is my second. I really would honestly say through high school and even college, there was no one teacher that particularly, grabbed my attention or helped me see things. But Bob Balster was my PhD thesis advisor, and he was a fabulous mentor. He's retired now. My thesis work there, I started to do drug abuse work. At that point, I was doing structure activity with phencyclidine, and we were, and we used squirrel monkeys to do drug discrimination so we could see if the monkeys could recognize what were the active parts on that phencyclidine molecule. We actually found a couple of really interesting things. We did get a science publication out of that. One was that the phencyclidine, we were MDMA receptors and molecules, that was not part of it, but we did find that phencyclidine did interact with the sigma opioid receptor, which is when, some of the opioids, some of the ones that have really mixed receptor properties actually do cause psychotomimetic, people can have delusions, hallucinations, that sort of thing. And we found phencyclidine is a very complicated molecule. It has analgesic properties, probably also through the opiate system. It does have psychotomimetic properties, also muscle relaxant. So it acts on a number of different receptors. And we were using structure activity and squirrel monkey models to try to differentiate which receptors, which part of the structure and which receptors were responsible for the various actions of this very, very interesting molecule, which remains interesting to this day. Ketamine is basically ketamine and phencyclidine have a lot. We did some work with ketamine as well, have a lot in common, and interesting to see these things revive now as a potential therapeutic. So if I could have the next slide. But then I met my husband, and before he was my husband, and he was on his way down to South Carolina. So we got married, and I moved down here to South Carolina, and I have, as you know, been here ever since. This is my husband giving me my diploma because he was faculty, and when I graduated from medical school, so that's me getting my diploma. Next slide. And there we are. See, we lived on the beach. You know, that Charleston is one of the few places. I'm getting back now to why it is we've stayed for so long in this one place. It's actually a great medical center, especially if you're interested in the addictions. It's only about 8 or 9 miles from the coast, so you can live on the beach and drive yourself to work at a nice, at a place with a lot of intellectual rigor and interesting things going on every single day. So that made it difficult to go. So if I could have the next slide. We did look around a lot, but ended up just thinking. So then we basically started having kids. That also makes it hard to leave, because then your kids are in first grade and you don't want to disrupt them. Then they're in high school and they don't want to go. And, next slide, it's, the more burden you have. So now, just to introduce my children, Monica Ann is the oldest, as you can see by the uniform here. She's a nurse. Next slide. Jessie is my middle daughter. Here she is, graduating from medical school, and she's about to start a fellowship at UCSD. If I could have the next slide. And then here's my youngest, Claire, right here. She's graduating from the University of Southern California in this picture, but she is now in law school. So I've got 3 lovely daughters who are all able to earn their own living, and I'm very proud of that and happy about that. But and hoping that I hope they'll all get married. They're all single, so I'm hoping they're get married and have some children soon. So next slide. And then, so, I was just going to say, some people say, why would you say, South Carolina, it's such a conservative state. So many embarrassing things, emanate from South Carolina. But if you can, in my next slide, but it really is the beach and the people and the, if I could have the next slide, and the intellectual atmosphere that's, that have made us that has made this such an easy place to stay. So that's sort of one of my second lessons is, major themes is I think it's, you really want to have a good, strong career. You want to do everything you can to make the right choices for that to happen. But I tell you what, I'm a big believer in this work-life balance and in making sure that you don't compromise things that are far too important for your career. I think careers are important, and family and living a place you love, all that kind of stuff, they're all equal to me. If I could have the next slide. So I'm just going to take a few minutes to go through my career activities and then talk a little bit about what I've learned at each step of that way. Next slide. So my first job, I was a clinician at the Veterans Administration Medical Center, and I was a full-time clinician. There wasn't any, and so that was a busy job. And what I started to do was just study and write about what I was seeing clinically. And that really was comorbidity, the comorbidity of schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, PTSD, not so much early trauma in veterans. This was a lot of the Vietnam War era when I first started. It was sort of mid-'80s. Then I did get interested in gender differences, but let me just tell you a little story about schizophrenia. So one of the things I noticed was that a lot of our schizophrenic patients were coming in. We didn't do urine drug screens all the time, but when we do them, they had cocaine, cannabinoids, amphetamines in their urine. So, and my thought was, somebody's psychotic and their psychosis is getting worse, but they're taking something that can produce psychosis. The first thing you want to know is, have they taken something else? And then if so, shouldn't we just give them a cooling off period and see what happens when they're not high on cocaine and schizophrenic, rather than, because what happens otherwise is we would just be upping the dose. We'd say, oh, this person had breakthrough symptoms. This guy with schizophrenia had breakthrough symptoms. In spite of the medications he's on, we need to increase his medication. So I did talk, I was noticing lots of high levels of positive urine drug screens when we did them. And I wanted to order them on all schizophrenic patients. I wanted to get about 100 or so, you know, the nice sample size. It makes your statistics easier. And I started doing that, and I got called into the administrator at the VA who said, you're not allowed to, you know, you can't order, that's expensive. You can't order urine drug screen. So we had to sit down. I said, you know, I'm convinced. I said, just let me show you that there's a lot of drug use among these guys, and so we need to know that, because that will inform treatment, and you know, we may be able to keep their antipsychotic doses lower. We may be able to actually try to treat the substance use. I mean, this would be important to treatment. So I convinced him. We did 100 consecutive schizophrenics with urine drug screens. It was my first American Journal publication. And we, you know, I don't know, it was about 60%, I think, that had positive urine drug screens for something. So we thought that was a pretty substantial and clinically significant finding. And it really got me interested in the comorbidity area. And believe it or not, this was back in, as I said, like the mid 80s, and comorbidity wasn't that big a deal. People didn't really understand or treat it. You either treated the psychiatric illness or you treated the drug and alcohol illness. And this whole idea, you know, we're in a completely more enlightened era now in terms of having dual diagnosis programs, having, you know, tracks that for people with PTSD and also substance use. Back then, it was just unheard of. So I would say my first 10 or 15 clinical publications were just about, hey guys, look, there's a lot of substance use among psychiatric patients. I mean, that was really, I mean, I published that in a million different ways. And we did psychiatric interviews on every, you know, we did substance use interviews on every psychiatric patient. We did psychiatric interviews on every substance using patient. We did the urine drug screen stuff. We did that, you know, but anyway, I was convinced that this was something, again, that was very important for psychiatrists in particular to know, and very, and I really felt like the field wasn't appreciating it. So I spent a few years just trying to break through on that. And I did get funding. That's the other, third important point. So somewhere in there, not too far along, I ended up getting funded. I got my first, it was called a first award. It would be sort of like a K award in these days, which means it's a career development. So they understand this is a person who's never had NIH funding or federal funding before, but they think they've got promise. And so with you're mentored, but you have a project that they like. And that, again, made a world of difference. So I don't think anybody who's a full-time clinician these days could really get a research career started. I just don't think it's possible. I mean, I wish I could say we really could have the triple threat, the person that's a great clinician and a great, but clinical work is busy, and it's you know, the documentation requirements and the EHR and everything else. You need free time. People need free time to do research. So that's the second thing I would encourage anybody who's a clinician in this group who really wants to have a clinical research career needs to negotiate right from the outset. You either get yourself a grant or you negotiate time early on in the contract where you can have some research time. I think it's just very important. So I got funding, which protected some time for research, which was really sort of, you know, then I felt like I was kind of off. I really still loved clinical work, did a lot of it, but, you know, I was at least 50% freed up for research activities and writing and other stuff. Next slide. I was then invited to our alcohol research center was putting in a renewal, and I got invited to put in a project in that. I put in a project that had to do with PTSD and alcohol dependence. This was a really wonderful experience. Our Charleston Alcohol Research Center has been going for about 25 years now, which is pretty amazing because it's a competitive renewal every 5 years, and you have to show that you've done a lot of work. They really do have basic researchers working with clinical researchers, and there's a lot of human laboratory stuff and neuroimaging stuff sort of in the middle there that helps mechanistically. And that was a model. I learned a lot from watching that, seeing that model and seeing how that worked, and watching the iterative research process, how basic science could inform clinical studies, but also there is backward flow there. There are things that work in the clinic and we don't know why. So, you know, to also bring some of that stuff back and say, hey, it's really easy for you to do these experiments. We think, you know, and I'll talk a little bit about some of the ways we've done some in centers that we've developed since then. So that was a great experience. Next slide. Just sort of seeing team science at work. But, you know, my study was on PTSD, and it was actually neuroendocrine neurobiologic. That really sort of launched me in that direction of PTSD, early trauma, substance use disorders. Again, you know, when I think back to my mother's story, I can't help but think there was something drew me in this direction. But if you had asked me at that time, am I consciously aware that I'm trying to solve some childhood dilemma through my research, I would have said, you got to be kidding, you know. But the truth was, I was totally fascinated by this area. I was totally fascinated by the idea that early trauma could in some way change someone's brain and someone's neurobiology in a way that made them so much more vulnerable to the development of substance use disorders. And that is, in fact, a truth. I felt like I noticed it about 20 years ago, just in my interview in clinical. We have been doing studies, you know, ever since then, looking at this in various ways, trying to figure out the mechanism that ties this early life trauma to these later life vulnerabilities. But my collaborator in a lot of this work, and one of the people that continues it most actively, is Sudie Back. She's the attractive blonde lady on the right here in this picture. We've worked together for, I guess, 25, 30 years now. She started as a research assistant with me. And so all through graduate school and everything, although she was at Yale, she was at other places, but we continued to collaborate. We've worked on gender differences in this relationship. And then we started a whole center based on that, and I'll talk about that in a minute. We worked on psychotherapeutic treatments. We've developed a therapy called COPE, which combines PTSD and exposure-based treatment for PTSD with cognitive behavioral therapy for substance use disorders. And that's actually been demonstrated effective in, you know, probably 10 studies now, including a New England Journal article. We've been working on pharmacotherapeutic treatments, I'd say predominantly alpha adrenergic, although we've certainly I did some work with SSRIs. We've done some work with oxytocin. So we've kind of looked at a few different potential mechanisms in there. Next slide. Another of my so that's always, so this PTSD early trauma stuff is always, continues to be an interest. But then we got this opportunity. NIDA decided to fund these clinical trials network. So basically their idea was to bridge the gap between basic science or what was going on in universities and what happened out on the front lines, which really was often not evidence-based. And they decided to do that by picking academic centers throughout the country that could demonstrate that they could have a really close collaboration with community treatment programs in their area. And so that while the studies would emanate from the academic center, we would train, conduct, and the studies were actually done by frontline treatment providers in places, in our case, throughout initially rural South Carolina. Now we actually do studies in Georgia and Alabama, and, you know, we've expanded considerably. We've been at this since 2000. And if I could have the next slide, and still we've got our fourth renewal now. These are a couple of my incredible and colleagues that I could not do without. Susan Sani has been our node coordinator and sort of my, you know, first lieutenant at this for 20 years now. And we worked together before that. And then Roy Sampson started with us working on the CTN, but now she's moved on to another initiative that I'll talk about. But basically our idea, and there's so many other colleagues that have worked on this that have just been incredible, but I'd have to say Susan and I are probably the ones that have been at it from the beginning to end right now. The mission is to develop a dialogue between research and treatment communities to bring state-of-the-art treatments from the laboratory to the clinic, but also to look at existing treatment practices. So, for instance, Betty Ford Clinic had a way that they said, we know, this gap. People fall off the map between inpatient treatment and getting to outpatient. Betty Ford said, that doesn't happen to us. We have a great way of ensuring continuity of care, ensuring that people get from inpatient to outpatient. And so we had to manualize it, and we tested the Betty Ford. So first of all, it was one thing, okay, Betty Ford, maybe your treatment works for Hollywood movie stars and wealthy, wealthy people that can afford Betty Ford, but would it work in rural South Carolina with people that are going to public treatment facilities? So that was sort of the question. And would it work in New York City where people can disappear into the woodwork all over the place? So it was an interesting study, and we had some positive findings from that. And then one of our jobs also is to disseminate the findings. Once we had a good finding, we had all this linkage with frontline treatment providers, so we would try to implement, disseminate, and then help them implement what we had discovered was evidence-based care. Next slide. Over the years, through the CTN, I think the CTN itself has conducted about 150 or so studies in these 20 odd years. Our site has probably been involved in 40 of those trials. And as I said, we've got a pretty big and pretty excellent team that works on this. And we have our tentacles reach out now to, all throughout the Southeast. In fact, we call ourselves the Southeastern Consortium. So next slide. So what did I learn from that? I mean, the CTN has been a great experience for me, Clinical Trials Network. And if any of you ever get the chance to work at your respective institutions, you learn a lot. So the steering committee is all of these, the steering committee initially, it's all the PIs from all over the country. And of course, Harvard's in there, Yale's in there, NYU, Columbia, UCLA, really top-notch universities. We sit in a steering committee probably 2 or 3 times a year. Initially, our steering committee was us, and it was the leaders of frontline treatment settings. So that was fascinating to have this, these academics trying to get practical. These guys are really very much interested. How can I implement this? Is it going to be too expensive? Is it generalizability? So I felt like we really learned a lot about that, about just flexibility and the importance of really listening to other people and really trying to incorporate the best of a number of different types of ideas, and then teamwork, because goodness knows you cannot do this stuff alone. And, it's so important to have a good, strong team. And it's so important to value that team and to make sure that every member of that team feels that you value them and understands that their work is really important to the big picture and to the big product. So, I think the CTN has brought that one home to me in many different ways. So next slide. The other area that, are between the Alcohol Research Center, and then my interest in PTSD leading to this idea that there were gender differences. We put in an application in 2004 for a NIH-funded center that basically studies sex and gender differences. It's called a SCORE, Sex and Gender Differences in Translational Research in all sorts of ways. So SCOREs are, I think there's 12 of them throughout the nation. They focus in all kinds of areas. One person is studying urinary incontinence with their team, another one cardiovascular disease, another one metabolic syndrome. We're in the stress, substance use, gender differences area. And so, as you can see, we've been at this since 2004. My incredibly valuable partner who is now taking this over, and all of this has been Amy McCrae. And basically, so we always had, what we've generally had is 2 basic science projects and 2 clinical projects, and there's a lot of crosstalk. So like the 2 clinical projects might be using similar stress paradigms and or EMA or whatever, and looking at maybe opiates and cannabinoids. And then the 2 basic science projects might be opioids and cannabinoids as well, but and with similar methodology, so that we can really crosswalk in various directions and have some iterative processes. In this group, we've been studying things like oxytocin, which is one of the things that you can really go back and forth from the lab to the to human studies. We've been looking at the adrenergic agents because, again, you know, doxazosin, some of those others, you can easily go back between the lab and the and human studies. You know, you can crosswalk that pretty easily. If I could have the next slide. So we've been at this one since 2004. So I guess we're in our 4th, you know, our 4th reiteration. And basically this was sort of from, this slide is from the last iteration, but we had Gary Aston Jones looking at mechanistic studies, relationships between CRF, norepinephrine, oxytocin, and orexin systems. One of the things that we had looked at, we had seen in our human laboratory studies, was increased sensitivity to noradrenergic provocation in females. So we feel like one of the mechanisms by which women seem to be more sensitive to this stress substance use relationship, which is more closely tied in women than men, is because their noradrenergic system gets turned up more rapidly. It's a more sensitive noradrenergic system. So in looking at those possible mechanisms and what are the therapeutic implications, and then we've got Amy McCrae, again, my colleague, who is taking this over. We're co-PIs now, and at the next iteration, she will take the lead. But we've been looking at human laboratory as well as clinical studies, looking at these agents, guanfacine. Right now, we've got a lofexidine study in looking for gender differences in opioid dependence in men and women, using EMA to see what the lofexidine does in daily, you know, life situations when people experience stressful experiences and when their craving is high. In all of these studies, we do careful histories of early life trauma. Those of you who work in this area at all know that people with substance use disorders, it's an incredible number of them, have horrible early life trauma. And, you know, one of our hypotheses is that those people are going to be even more sensitive. In fact, we've done some experiments where with oxytocin's been a really difficult peptide to work with. I think that the findings, its actions in humans are fairly inconsistent. We now know that there's polymorphisms of the receptor that impact that. But also, I think it's influenced by gender. I think it's influenced by setting, and I think it's influenced by someone's psychological or early life profile. And in one of our studies, we actually did find that the one group that responded best to oxytocin was people with early life trauma, both men and women who had early life trauma. So perhaps that one of the deficits that we might see in these folks over time, you know, as we study this more over time, it's actually hard to look at oxytocin levels in the human brain, but could be that they have lower oxytocin, so they're more sensitive to exogenous administration. So if I can have the next slide. Okay. All right. So this is my final little bit of my career, and that is administrative career activities. And I know that probably invokes a lot of groans and eye rolls, and people, especially people who are really good scientists, usually just hate administrative activities. And so I sort of got backed into any administrative duties, but when we were when I was in the Alcohol Research Center, as well as a lot of the other studies, even our SCORE studies, I used the GCRC, our General Clinical Research Center, a lot, because we'd be doing an infusion study of CRF, and we'd need monitoring of blood pressure and heart rate and cortisol and everything very frequently. So high intensity human laboratory procedures. You want nurses, you want a very nicely controlled environment to do that. So I was one of the highest users of the GCRC, about 15 years ago. And our GCRC director was abruptly left. And for the first time in like 40 years, they lost the renewal to the GCRC. And that was like a heartbreak for a smaller university like MUSC. So the dean asked me to take over for the renewal. And it was like, I was pretty happy doing my own thing. I had my own research that was going pretty well. But I thought, I don't want to be at a university that doesn't have a GCRC, and there didn't seem to be anybody else obvious, because we had worked there so much. I really knew how the thing worked, and I know how to write a grant. So I thought, okay, I'll take this over. And that was really, a huge lift to write one of those for the first time when I knew we were up against a whatever. We had one failed application. I was new to, a lot of people are the associate GCRC director for a few years before they have to take over. But anyway, we got refunded and it was great. But when I went to the first meeting of the GCRCs at that time, this is probably early 90s or something, were all white males, directors. They were all white males. There wasn't a woman. I was the only woman there. And they were all diabetologists or endocrinologists of one sort or the other. They were all internal medicine. I mean, everybody, deep internal medicine guys that were looking at mechanisms, and really smart. I mean, I'm not, really, but that was the kind of people that used the GCRC and led the GCRC in that day. So when I went to my first meeting, I thought, oh, this is going to be, I'm a psychiatrist for one thing. And then, I'm the only woman in this room. But at the first meeting, they said, hey, guys, congratulations on being refunded, but we are changing this program and we're changing it to this was in early 2000. We're changing it to this Clinical and Translational Science Award. So we got to have one fun renewal period, and then we had to put in this large grant that was actually much larger than a GCRC. It was supposed to be statewide. You were supposed to be taking over the infrastructure resources for your research for your entire institution, and then hopefully providing some to other people in the state. You were supposed to have really intense community engagement, so you needed community members on your advisory board, a lot of regulatory science. Anyway, the RFA, the epistle that they sent out describing what you had to write for this was like 100 pages. It was just so. I spent like the next 2 or 3 years after we had our successful renewal, just trying to figure out what this darn CTSA thing was and how we were going to do it. So if I could have the next slide, because somehow I found myself in the hot seat for that. So fortunately, I had 20 years of really strong team building, and I had these great teams, Susan Sawney, Amy McCrae, Louise Haynes, others, Sudi Back, who could really just run these other things and do a great job and make great decisions for everything, because this became pretty all-consuming. So what the CTSA is, working as a national consortium, these institutions share a common vision to improve human health by transforming the research and training environment to enhance the efficiency and quality of clinical and translational research. So when I say there was a lot of regulatory science, it wasn't like, let's make more regulations. It was like, we want to know what your IRB times are. We want to know how you're going to create efficiencies in that. We want to know how you're going to make IND processes faster. So they wanted everything faster, better, less hassle. I mean, that was kind of it was also the time when biomedical informatics were really being introduced big time. And the CTSA's really adopted the importance of biomedical informatics, and a lot of what we were able to do was get our biomedical informatics teams to create things that made some of these processes easier and helped us with efficiency. The other nice thing about this is, again, it's 60 institutions throughout the United States. anything you create using NIH funding, you have to share. Now, some things are harder to share than others, but biomedical informatics is one tool that's the tools that you create in that can be very easy to share. And so there's been, I really feel like joining this consortium has sort of lifted all of our boats up a little bit higher because, we share everything that you have to, if you're going to report it, and they know you got CTSA resources to do it, you're going to. It's actually been very useful. If I could have the next slide. And so, as I said, this is the South Carolina Clinical and Translational Research. We have statewide partnerships where every biomedical research enterprise in the state is somehow involved. If I could have the next slide. And it's just a big complicated, and this is all the areas we have to provide. See that little thing, CTRC, that was what we used to be, that was the GCRC. So now what this whole program used to be about was just providing this nice controlled unit on your campus where people could do high-end procedural human research, now becomes one of 9 or 10 programs or commitments that the CTSA has. So it's been interesting. Ours is called the South Carolina Clinical and Translational Research Institute. And so from there, because I took this over, they wanted people to have a high position in their institution to be the PI of that. They made me the Associate Dean for Clinical and Translational Research. And then because it was an institution-wide thing, I moved over to the Provost's office and became the Associate Provost for Clinical and Translational Research. And then our Vice President for Research left. Actually, he was called an Associate Provost for Research. He left, and they started a search. So, and I was already, up to my elbows in this. And, you would have thought I could, and still to this day, I could have walked away. It was sort of a take it or leave it thing. So people said, you should apply for this position. I said, well, you know what? After I did it as an intern. So our associate provost for research leaves, and I'm kind of there. And they say, what would you do this for an intern while we get the search committee together and everything? And so I said, sure. And then the provost says to me, well, are you going to apply? And I said, well, I would apply if, I said, I need more of a budget. I need some money that's more discretionary, money that I can use. I said, because right now I had a big budget. I mean, it's huge, but it was all tied up in the IRB and grants and contracting. Every penny was committed in one direction or another. You really would have to, you had to short some big office to get money to spend on things to invest in things, growth areas. And I said, and also it really ought to be a VP for research because every other institution has a VP for research. So making an associate provost, I said, so, you could change a few things, I'd apply. And then the next thing I know, this is typical, I get asked to chair the search committee. They said, I guess they don't want to do what I said. So I chaired the first search committee. Meanwhile, I'm in the interim position, chairing the search committee, and I literally was fine with walking away. But we handed them the slate of candidates listed, and this is a year later, and the president and the provost said to me, now, Kathleen, what did you say about how do you think we could make this position better? And I was like, geez, let me see. I can find the list on my computer that I typed up a year ago. So they reopened the search. I guess that the initial candidates weren't satisfactory. They reopened the search, and then I ended up with the position. They gave me a little bit of discretionary funding and changed it to a VPR. And so, this is what I've discovered about administrative stuff is you don't want to do it early in your career. That's one thing I'd say, because, you really do want to have a scientific track record. You want to, you want some accomplishments, and you want a direction and a team so that your science can carry on without you being there every minute. But on the other hand, it does allow you to do some things. One of the things that I discovered when I was chairing the search for the associate provost for research, I said to myself, something, I could do a better job than any of these candidates. And that's part of, what spurred me on the second time was like, I like to solve problems. I like to tackle a good problem and solve it. I like to make things easier for myself and for other people. And to me, that's the most, that was a lot of the fun of doing administrative work, was trying to make the environment better for everybody's research, not just my own. And then to be able to select different areas and try to sort of promote areas where you could see, hey, this is, so we basically really built a great biomedical informatics team. There's been a couple of areas where I could see growth would be very important for the institution. And so, that allows you to kind of support and see some of those things happen. But like any job, I've been doing this one for about 7 years now, and I'm, ready to move on probably and get back to my own research. So I actually retire from this position in July. And if I could have the next slide. One of the things that being in this position and running the CTSA, when we had the opioid, the opioid crisis, when that first became so apparent, and states and federal government actually decided to invest some money in it. Again, we put together a great team. We had people from all over the state. A lot of this, we leveraged connections that we had developed both through the CTN and through my VPR role, and got some money from the state to do trainings and naloxone. We have like 16 different initiatives that is called the MUSC South Carolina MAT Access, Medication Assisted Treatment Access Team. So that's one of the things that I will go back to, or I've been involved from the beginning, but it's the kind of thing that I look forward to being able to be more involved in when I don't have so many administrative duties. If I could have the next slide. And training, I just have to put in a plug for training and training grant activities. It's when I've been a mentor for probably 25 to 30 people's K awards. So that's probably my favorite. So, it's like your sweet spot. Like some people like kids that are 1 and 2 years old. Others like the teenagers. And my favorite sort of level of training, I'd have to say, is early career people, and just sort of helping them to really blossom to independence. And I think it's for a couple of reasons, probably because I'm so busy and fly around so much that I really can't, be a day-to-day. I'm not a good day-to-day mentor at this point. There was a time when I could do that better. I'm not very good at that, but I am good at sort of looking at, somebody's larger career trajectory and saying, this is a good direction, this one's not. And I love editing papers and grants and, working on that kind of stuff, which is all stuff that people tend to do a little more of when they're in their early faculty years. But as I said, it's been one of the most satisfying aspects. I'd say training, mentoring is probably more like it. I've always found it to be a two-way exchange of knowledge and ideas. I have learned just as much from people that I have mentored as they have from me. I'm convinced of that. And very often they've led me in directions I never would have gone in, because they just have this new idea and they say, have you thought of, or have you, and stuff that, so, I mean, to me, it's been really a two-way street and just been invaluable. I started out, I was a co-PI on the RT32, which is postdoctoral training. And it was a translation. We had clinical and basic science people. They would meet together weekly, the postdocs from both, and just exchange information. It was really a wonderful, very, very rich environment for idea generation. Then we created this program that put a research track in the psychiatry residency. I actually did this program with Sudie Bax, works with me on that, and Kelly Barth and Sarah Book. So we have a research track, a very robust research track in our psychiatry residency. Then we moved on to summer research programs. There's a lot of summer research programs for medical students and graduate students, but not a lot of them do clinical research, which I think is really important, especially for medical students, to understand that it's not just bench. If you're a researcher, it's not just bench, but there's some really interesting human stuff. So we have a summer program now. Mostly, we really have a lot of underrepresented minorities and stuff that start with us in the summer program. And then we've got these institutional faculty development awards that basically give K awards, so they cover 75% of a junior faculty's salary for anywhere from 2 to 5 years, just depending, so they can get their careers started. And I've been involved in, probably 4 out of 5 of those. The CTSA has one. We have one funded by NIDA. And we have one that's funded by the Office of Research in Women's Health. So those have been a lot of fun. So that actually allows you to assemble sort of a cadre of junior faculty from various disciplines that are all interested in research careers. And again, lots of cross-pollination of ideas and methodology and that sort of stuff when you get these groups together, and they're all in a really rapidly ascending learning curve at that point. Next slide. So I think this may be about the end. Oh yeah, I just wanted to bring, ISAM, that's actually how I got on this call, and one of the things that brings us together. As I said, when you're stay at one institution for a long time, you really need to branch out in other ways. So those extra institutional activities have been really important. I've, been a member and was ex-president of AAAP, American Academy of Addiction Psychiatry. MRSA, I was ex-president of that, which is the American Medical Association for Education and Research. And then I am the immediate past president of ISAM. And so what I'd say about that is that, it gives you a lot of collaborative interactions. It really expands your scientific perspective and knowledge base. And it really also been really fun in exposing us to different academic and societal cultures. And, especially in the addictions is heavily weighted one country to the other. There is a lot of social, cultural aspects to what we call an addiction, how we treat an addiction, how we define it. So this is an area I think where it's particularly important to talk to other people. I mean, none of us really have the holy grail in this. So it's kind of important to hear the various perspectives on this very complex and thorny disease that we're all trying to help. Next slide. Just a few other nice pictures of ISAM. Here, this first one, it's Marilyn, the executive secretary, and myself dressed up in our costumes for the ISAM meeting in Korea. Abu Dhabi was another wonderful meeting. Tarek Gadwad was our host there. And then finally, India. That was the last ISAM meeting before the pandemic shut down. So next slide. I'm just going to give a few take-home points, and it's not going to be the 10 commandments. It's only going to be 5. And so if I could have the next slide. I think the first one is to enjoy a career path that brings you joy, something that you have passion for, something that, I say to myself, I am so lucky that I've had this job that I never dreaded going to work. I have never, I shouldn't say never. There was probably a time or two when, I would have rather say, but for the most part, every single day I could get up and say, I don't work in a factory. I get up and look forward to something new and interesting and different every day. And I interact with great people. And as I've moved on in my career, I can actually choose the people I interact with even more. So that just, makes it even better. So I'd say choose a career path that brings you joy and that you have passion for. Next slide. I'm a big one on life balance. I'm a big one on saying that it may make time for family, health, and hobbies, that it's really, really important to keep yourself healthy and to value your family and friends. Next slide. I think it's also really important to cultivate great colleagues, mentors, and mentees. It's really one of the most satisfying aspects of a successful scientific career, and it will contribute to your success. It will not take away from your success. So having good mentees will only enrich your science. It doesn't take away time from your science. I promise you, it really makes it richer and better. And next slide. Perseverance. Academics is not for the faint of heart. It really isn't. So, expect those rejections, expect those papers that get rejected, expect those grants that get rejected. I mean, it will happen. I mean, that's just the way it goes. And you just have to develop a tough skin about some of these things and just sort of try to keep working it. Okay, that didn't work. What's a better angle? How can I change this? How can I improve myself or my paper or whatever it is that you're working on? Because persistence and determination are really important. And you know what? They can trump a lot of other things. They can trump talent. They can trump education. They can trump a lot of other things. Next slide. And then I'd say keep your options open. As you can tell, my career has been a little bit windy. I've sort of gone from one thing to another. And, I think while, as I said, early on in your career, I think it's pretty important to develop what is an area of expertise and what is it that you bring to the table. I know a lot about X, and no matter what the collaboration is, I can bring that to the table. But then if someone takes it and says, yeah, I could use your information and we could do this. So like, for instance, just as an example, one of my most recent collaborations is with the biomedical informatics team, and it's around using natural language processing to try to pick up information about opioid use and now methamphetamine dependence out of the chart. A lot of that isn't in the structured fields, but there's probably a lot of things that people tell you and that are written in clinical notes that is of value. Another really interesting project that we just put in, again, we're using natural language processing and AI to actually, again, cull out of charts markers for social determinants of health, and where our hypothesis is about long hauler COVID people and who is it that gets sicker and stays sick. And our hypothesis is that it does have something to do. Social determinants of health probably play a big role in the COVID long haulers. And we're, because the social determinants are not picked up very well in the EHR, again, you need to use these AI and other methods of trying to glean that information from the clinical chart. So, yeah, I mean, like I said, I know what I know, but if other, and I know that I can have add value to collaborations, but really important to branch out and hear what other people have to say, and then try to draw that bridge. How can we bring these two really fascinating areas together in a way that really could impact human health or create some great science? And I think with that, I think this may be my last slide. I'm happy to take any questions or comments. Thank you, Hamid.
Kathleen, it's Loretta. If I could just say one thing, having worked with you for a while, and I'm not a scientist, I work on the administration side with Kathleen for the VPR office. What I have noticed about you is your generosity. First of all, being a woman in this position, you've given yourself as a model to others. And I see all the women you have mentored at MUSC. I think MUSC is very proud of the number of female scientists who do extraordinary work. You're also just generous to everybody, and it's you give of yourself so much, and it makes everybody want also to be working with you and to collaborate. You're not this person with the big ego, even though you are incredibly accomplished at what you do. And I've always wanted to say thank you for your generosity. Thank you for your willingness to be there for everybody. And at the same time, you find your parameters and your balance. You're not a yes person to everything, but you know how to guide people in a really beautiful way to reach their optimal, potential. And your career is pretty outstanding. So I've really enjoyed working with you. It's been a pleasure, honestly.
Thank you, Loretta. That is so kind. It really is. So,
Jean-Luc, the floor is yours to manage them. Yeah.
Yes. So this is really what I was predicting. I really enjoyed this talk, and you covered a lot of issues that I think young people and older folks like me need to follow. But one thing I was actually interested in, being in South Carolina, when you showed that slide of all of your mentees or people who are working with you, I was expecting to see a few African-American faces because there's such a high number of Black Americans in your state, but I didn't see any of that. So what have you been doing in terms of diversity, in terms of going forward? I think that's going to become more of an issue in terms of the science, especially with substance use disorders. Yes,
Jean-Luc, that's a great point and a great question. We definitely, I'd say one of the things, South Carolina's definitely been behind the times in terms of the research, in a lot of things, let me just put it that way. But in terms of attracting underrepresented minorities to research, although we had a very proactive dean of the medical school. I don't know if you know Deborah Deese, but she was our associate dean for student affairs. And we had the highest, other than the historically Black medical schools, we had the highest percentage of African American male graduates from medical school for like 5 years in a row. And we're still very high. We have an extraordinarily diverse medical student population, but that doesn't necessarily translate into all of these folks coming into research. I mean, that just sort of, they primarily head into clinical directions. We've been much more aggressive lately about trying to recruit underrepresented minorities into training programs. And I'd have to say we've done a much better job in the last 4 or 5 years. I think in our DART program, the residency and summer fellowship were about 30%. So I do have some better pictures. I hadn't even thought about that, Jean-Luc, until you said it. But I would say until, 5 to 10 years ago, we were a little oblivious. We were not, the medical school was tracking it well. In the research enterprise, not so much. I'd say we've really tried to up our game and over recruit. And so in our DART program, I will go make presentations for summer students to a couple of the historically Black universities in our state to see if I can, talk some of those students into coming. And so we've had some improvement. And, the other thing is we really diversified our mentorship team. And in order to do that, we had to get some mentors from, underrepresented minorities from other states, underrepresented minorities from South Carolina are willing to come and stay in Charleston because they know that Charleston is actually a pretty enlightened and nice city. But you bring people from, and I can tell you, not only underrepresented minorities, just about anybody from California or up north. A lot of times, South Carolina doesn't really appeal. And especially they worry about that the state is very conservative. They worry, that the Jim Crow era is not far behind. And when I've tried to recruit some folks, I've literally had them say, well, where's my cadre of faculty that I relate to or who can mentor me? So, I mean, it's a problem. We need to build better, our faculty better so that we can recruit in those trainees because, we really do need to diversify more, but it's a topic of active efforts and discussion. So could you talk a little bit, you didn't mention any of the more translational aspect of your network. Any data that you would like to share in terms of response to intervention? I think that's really important for people who are looking at treatment for substance use disorder. Yeah. So I'd say our recent sort of area of interest is, as I talked about with the score, we're interested in the stress-substance use relationship, and in particular, gender differences. And we did some earlier work, again, it was human laboratory, doing stress paradigms like the Trier with cocaine-dependent individuals, and found that women were more, certainly more susceptible to the psychosocial stressors, and in particular, they had more HPA axis dysregulation and more noradrenergic dysregulation. So the heart rate was like off the charts for cocaine-dependent women compared to cocaine-dependent men, and compared to controlled men and women. And their cortisol, ACTH balance was off. So we decided to sort of hone in on that, and there's not good therapeutics that target the HPA axis really right now, none that don't have a lot of adverse potential consequences. So we went after the adrenergic system, and that's what we're doing right now. We did a laboratory study again, and the people at Yale looked at guanfacine, and again, an alpha blockade showed more response in cocaine or opiate, I think they might have done both, dependent women than men. They've also shown that in nicotine dependent women than men, so that if you tamp down the noradrenergic system, if women respond more than men, and they report less craving, their diminishment of craving is less. So those are human laboratory studies. So now the study that we're looking at is looking at lofexidine, a newer, in the United States anyway, alpha blocking agent, and we wanted to move it into a clinical trial. So we're actually opioid dependent men and women on lofexidine. We're using EMA to monitor their stress on a daily basis and craving. So we probe them a couple of times a day, and then we're using a human laboratory test as well. So that's the study that we're doing right now. That's kind of following up on a lot of human laboratory stuff that, again, we had basic science colleagues that were finding the same thing. This was all part of the score. So our basic science colleagues looking at guanfacine and lofexidine found similar gender differences. So then we took it into the human laboratory, and from there to a clinical trial. I would have loved to do that with oxytocin, but our results were never consistent enough to really support it. So we're still working with that molecule, but different. It's not clinical trial material yet.
Okay, so I guess we're over time, so I'd like to close, and then I'll give you a chance, Kathleen, to say something. But I really enjoy your talk. This was really amazing. And Ahmed did a good job inviting you to talk to us today. And the path that you took was amazing. And the sharing of your family history back in Brooklyn. As an immigrant myself, when I first came to the United States, we were in Brooklyn at the time that you were growing up in Brooklyn also. So I feel like you are a Brooklyn sister to me. So keep doing what you're doing, and I really enjoyed it.
And I just want to thank everybody for their attention. I really appreciate your being on. It's, you kind of figure you're going to get on a thing and tell your story. This might be really boring to a lot of people. So I appreciate everybody's attention. And thank you, Ahmed, for inviting me, and John-Luc for the introduction.
Thank you very much, everyone. It was such a lovely talk, and I enjoyed a lot, and it was really educational. I highly kind of invite people who are interested to follow this talk series to be in touch with us in kind of the email that we have and the YouTube channel that we have. If you just look for ISAM Neuroscience Interest Group or ISAM-NIG, you can find all these talk series that we had in this series of wonderful talks online available. And we put Kathleen's talk as well on YouTube, so you can find the talk. And please share that with others who can be inspired by what people are doing. And that was really, really amazing. Thank you very much, everyone, for joining us today. And I hope that you will have a really nice rest of the day.
Bye-bye, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.